George Strait takes his granddaughter to college and honors the professor. Her reaction moves everyone. No one imagined that the history professor would fall to her knees when she saw who walked into the classroom that day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the University of Texas campus as Margaret Collins walked slowly toward her classroom, her worn leather briefcase feeling heavier than usual. At 58 years old, with silver streaks threading through her brown hair and deep lines etched around her eyes from decades of passionate teaching, Margaret carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had dedicated her entire life to education. Today marked the beginning of what she had decided would be her final semester as a professor of American history. The hallways of the Humanities building echoed with the familiar sounds of a new academic year beginning. Students chatted excitedly about summer adventures, while professors hurried past with stacks of syllabi and coffee cups. Margaret paused outside her classroom door, taking a deep breath before entering the space that had been her second home for the past 15 years. Room 212 had witnessed countless lectures, passionate discussions, and those magical moments when history came alive for her students. As she arranged her materials on the desk, Margaret's fingers traced the edge of a faded newspaper clipping she always kept in her lesson planner. The headline read, "Local Student Overcomes Financial Hardship to Pursue Teaching Dream." The article, written 25 years ago, featured a younger version of herself receiving a teaching award. Back then, her eyes sparkled with hope and determination. Now those same eyes held the weight of years spent fighting budget cuts, overcrowded classrooms, and an education system that seemed to value test scores over true learning. Margaret had always believed that history should be taught as a living, breathing narrative that connected to students' lives. Her specialty course, Music and Cultural Identity in American History, explored how songs reflected social movements, economic struggles, and the evolving American dream. She used everything from Civil War ballads to modern country music to help students understand their heritage, but lately, colleagues whispered that her methods were outdated, that students needed more technology and less storytelling. The wooden chairs in her classroom had hosted thousands of students over the years. Some had gone on to become teachers themselves, others had found careers in museums or historical societies, and a few had even credited her class with helping them understand their own family histories. These success stories had sustained Margaret through the difficult times, but now even those memories felt bittersweet as she faced the reality of leaving behind the profession that had defined her entire adult life. If you're watching this story unfold and finding yourself drawn into Margaret's world, we'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about the power of dedicated teachers. Your engagement helps us share more inspiring stories like this one. Students began filtering into the classroom, their conversations a mix of excitement and apprehension, typical of the first day. Margaret watched them settle into their seats, noting the diverse group that had enrolled in her course. There were traditional college-age students alongside older adults returning to education, military veterans using their benefits, and international students eager to understand American culture. Each face represented a story, a dream, a reason for being there that went beyond earning credits. Among the early arrivals was a young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and striking blue eyes who chose a seat in the middle of the room. She carried herself with quiet confidence, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. Her notebook was already open, pen ready, displaying the kind of preparedness that reminded Margaret why she had fallen in love with teaching in the first place. The girl wore a simple university sweatshirt and jeans, nothing that would distinguish her from the dozens of other freshmen filling the seats. Margaret began her ritual of writing the day's objectives on the whiteboard, her handwriting still elegant despite years of practice. "Welcome to Music and Cultural Identity in American History," she wrote, followed by, "How Songs Tell the Stories Textbooks Sometimes Forget." This opening line had launched hundreds of her classes, and even though her enthusiasm had dimmed, the words still carried the echo of her original passion. The classroom was nearly full now, with 32 students representing various majors and backgrounds. Margaret had always prided herself on creating an inclusive environment where everyone felt comfortable sharing their perspectives. She believed that understanding history required hearing multiple voices, especially those that had been marginalized or overlooked in traditional narratives. This philosophy had earned her both devoted students and critics who preferred more conventional approaches to historical education. As the official start time approached, Margaret noticed an unusual stirring among her students. Several were glancing toward the hallway, phones in hand, whispering to one another with barely contained excitement. She assumed it was the typical first-day energy, perhaps a campus celebrity or social media influencer passing by. College students were easily distracted by such things, and she had learned to begin her classes with extra engagement to capture their attention. Margaret picked up her coffee mug, a gift from former students that read "History teachers make the past come alive," and took a sip while surveying her classroom one final time before beginning. The irony of the mug's message wasn't lost on her. After 30 years of making history come alive for others, she felt as though her own passion had died a slow death under the weight of bureaucracy, standardized testing requirements, and the constant pressure to prove the relevance of humanities education in an increasingly technical world. The young blonde woman in the middle row was still glancing toward the door, checking her phone periodically with what appeared to be nervous anticipation. Margaret wondered if the girl was waiting for a friend or perhaps a parent who had promised to walk her to her first college class. Such gestures were becoming more common as families struggled with the transition of sending children to university. Outside the classroom windows, the Texas sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. The ancient air conditioning unit hummed loudly, a constant reminder of the building's age and the university's struggle with maintenance budgets. Margaret had submitted countless requests for classroom improvements over the years, most of which had been denied or indefinitely postponed. She had learned to work around broken equipment, inadequate supplies, and outdated technology, always finding ways to deliver quality education despite the obstacles. The clock on the wall showed exactly 9 o'clock, time to begin what Margaret had mentally labeled as the beginning of her farewell tour. She set down her coffee mug and moved toward the center of the classroom, preparing to deliver her opening remarks. Her voice, though tired, still carried the authority and warmth that had made her a beloved figure among serious students who appreciated her dedication to authentic learning. Just as Margaret opened her mouth to welcome her students to the new semester, the classroom door opened with a soft creak. The sound itself was unremarkable, but the collective gasp from 32 students and the sudden silence that followed made her pause mid-sentence. Something extraordinary was happening, something that would change not only this ordinary Tuesday morning, but the entire trajectory of her life's final chapter. The footsteps approaching from behind were measured and confident, accompanied by a softer pair that belonged to someone much younger. Margaret's instinct told her to turn around, but something in the electric atmosphere of the room made her hesitate. The students' faces showed expressions ranging from shock to pure joy, phones emerging from backpacks as the realization of what was happening spread through the classroom like wildfire. Margaret turned slowly, her heart pounding with an inexplicable mixture of anticipation and recognition. Standing in the doorway was a tall man wearing a perfectly pressed white shirt, dark jeans, and the kind of cowboy hat that only looked authentic on someone who had earned the right to wear it. His weathered face carried the lines of someone who had spent decades under stage lights and traveled countless miles on tour buses. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, stood in her humble classroom with a gentle smile and respectful posture that immediately put everyone at ease. Beside him stood the young blonde woman Margaret had noticed earlier, and suddenly everything clicked into place. This wasn't just any freshman student, this was Emma Strait, granddaughter of the most celebrated country artist in American history. The girl's nervous glances toward the door now made perfect sense, as did the excited whispers Margaret had dismissed as typical first-day chatter among students. Margaret's legs felt unsteady, as memories from 40 years ago came flooding back with startling clarity. She remembered that night at Murphy's Bar on the outskirts of Austin, where she had been working double shifts as a waitress to afford her textbooks and tuition. George Strait was just beginning to make a name for himself then, still playing small venues and honky-tonk bars across Texas, building the foundation of what would become a legendary career. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the cigarette smoke and hear the jukebox playing in the background. She had been studying for her American history midterm during her break, surrounded by books about westward expansion and the cultural impact of folk music. George had finished his set and was packing up his guitar when he noticed her textbooks spread across table 16. Their conversation had lasted only 20 minutes, but it had changed the course of her entire life. "Ma'am," George said, removing his hat with the same respectful gesture she remembered from decades ago. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm George Strait, and this is my granddaughter Emma. She's starting her freshman year, and when she told me she was taking American history with Professor Collins, I knew I had to meet you personally." The classroom remained in absolute silence, 31 students holding their collective breath as they witnessed something unprecedented. Several phones were discreetly recording, but the atmosphere was so reverent that even the most social media-obsessed students seemed to understand they were witnessing something sacred rather than just another viral moment. Margaret's voice caught in her throat as she tried to respond. The professional composure she had maintained for 3 decades of teaching suddenly crumbled as she stared into the kind eyes of the man who had unknowingly saved her educational dreams. Her hand instinctively moved toward her briefcase, where she had kept his note in a protective plastic sleeve for all these years, reading it whenever she felt like giving up on her calling to teach. "Professor Collins," George continued, his voice carrying the same gentle Texas drawl that had made him famous, "I've been following your academic work for years. Your paper on the evolution of country music as a mirror of American social change influenced several of my albums. The way you connected historical events to musical expression helped me understand my own art in a deeper way. When Emma mentioned your name, I knew it couldn't be coincidence." Emma stepped forward slightly, her confidence growing as she realized the profound connection unfolding before her eyes. "Grandfather told me about a teacher who had inspired him years ago, someone who understood that music and history were inseparable. I never imagined it could be you, Professor Collins. When I chose this class, it was because I wanted to understand how our family's music fits into the larger story of America." Margaret finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "Mr. Strait, I can't believe you remember our conversation from so long ago. You were so young then, just starting out, but you took time to listen to a struggling student's dreams about becoming a history teacher. What you did that night." She paused, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this unexpected reunion. George's expression softened as his own memories surfaced. "You were studying at Table 16, surrounded by books about American folk music and westward expansion. You told me you wanted to teach history in a way that would help students understand how music captured the soul of different eras. You said you believed that every song was a time capsule, preserving emotions and experiences that formal history books couldn't quite capture." The accuracy of his recollection stunned Margaret and brought tears to her eyes. She had been struggling financially that semester, working every available shift at Murphy's Bar while carrying a full course load. Her scholarship covered tuition, but textbooks, rent, and living expenses were stretching her resources to the breaking point. She had been considering dropping out and working full-time when fate brought George Strait into her life. "You left me a note that night," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, "with the tip money. I've kept it all these years." With shaking hands, she opened her briefcase and carefully withdrew a yellowed piece of paper protected in a clear sleeve. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "For your books and your dreams. Education changes everything. Keep believing in the power of teaching. G.S." George's eyes widened as he recognized his own handwriting from 4 decades ago. He had written similar notes to struggling students and young musicians throughout his early career, but he had never imagined that any of them would be preserved with such care. The sight of Margaret holding on to his encouraging words for all these years moved him profoundly. "You kept it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years you kept a note from a struggling musician in a honky-tonk bar." "That note got me through my darkest moments," Margaret replied, her composure finally breaking completely. "When I wanted to quit, when the bills were overwhelming, when I felt like my dreams were impossible, I would read your words. You believed in the power of education when I had stopped believing in myself. Your generosity that night literally saved my academic career." The students watched in fascination as this incredible story unfolded before them. Many were recording on their phones, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma stood between her grandfather and her professor, tears streaming down her face as she realized the cosmic significance of this moment. The man who had helped shape her understanding of music and integrity had unknowingly helped shape the woman who would now guide her intellectual development. George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, showing Margaret a screenshot of her academic article that he had saved years ago. "This paper you published about country music and social change influenced my album Honky Tonk Time Machine. Your analysis of how country music preserved working-class stories during economic transitions helped me write songs that connected more deeply with my audience's real experiences. Margaret stared at the phone screen in disbelief. Her academic work, published in a small educational journal with limited readership, had somehow reached and influenced one of the most successful recording artists in history. She had always hoped her research would make a difference, but she had never imagined it reaching beyond the academic community. "I wrote that paper thinking maybe 10 people would read it," she said, laughing through her tears. "I was trying to prove that popular music deserved serious academic study, that country songs were valid historical documents reflecting real social conditions." "Well, this person read it," George replied, gesturing to himself with characteristic humility. "And it changed how I approached my craft. You helped me understand that country music isn't just entertainment, it's cultural preservation. Every song I've written since then has been influenced by your perspective on music as historical testimony." Emma watched this exchange with growing amazement, beginning to understand that her enrollment in Professor Collins's class was far more than coincidence. Her grandfather had spent her entire childhood teaching her about the responsibility that came with their family's musical legacy, about honoring the stories and struggles of ordinary people through song. Now she was discovering that a random act of kindness from his youth had helped create the very teacher who would guide her understanding of that legacy. The other students sensed they were witnessing something historically significant, a moment that would become part of university lore. The girl sitting next to Emma leaned over and whispered, "I can't believe George Strait is in our history class. This is incredible." Similar conversations rippled through the room as students tried to process the surreal situation developing before their eyes. Margaret looked around at her students' faces, seeing an engagement and excitement she hadn't witnessed in years. Whatever happened next, this moment had already transformed what she had expected to be just another routine first day of class into something magical. The weariness that had settled into her bones over recent years seemed to lift slightly as she felt the old thrill of teaching returning. George cleared his throat gently, and the reverent silence in the classroom deepened. Margaret noticed that his expression had shifted to something more formal, more purposeful, as if he were preparing for a performance of great personal significance. Emma moved slightly closer to her grandfather, her eyes bright with anticipation and what appeared to be prior knowledge of what was about to unfold. "Professor Collins," George began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences. "What I'm about to share with you might come as a surprise. When Emma told me she had enrolled in your class, I did some research into your current situation here at the university." Margaret's brow furrowed slightly, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Around the classroom, students leaned forward in their seats, smartphones recording every word and gesture of this unprecedented moment in their academic lives. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the three central figures in this unfolding drama. George reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "I learned about the budget cuts that have affected your department, about the proposal to discontinue your course on music and cultural identity after your retirement. I also learned that you've been fighting for years to preserve humanities education in an environment that increasingly undervalues what teachers like you contribute to society." Margaret's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. The university's financial struggles were no secret, but having them discussed publicly, especially by someone of George Strait's stature, made her acutely aware of how the academic world must appear to successful people from other industries. She had spent countless hours in committee meetings, defending the relevance of her courses, writing reports justifying their existence, and watching her colleagues gradually lose their enthusiasm under similar pressures. "Professor Collins," George continued, unfolding the document he held, "you probably don't know this, but I've been quietly following your career for the past 20 years. After reading your first published paper, I made it my business to track down the young woman who had served me coffee and talked so passionately about using music to teach history." The classroom erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs as students began to grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a celebrity visit or a grandfather dropping off his granddaughter for college. This was a reunion 40 years in the making, orchestrated by someone who clearly understood the profound impact that Margaret Collins had made on his life and career. Emma stepped forward, her voice clear and confident despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Grandfather has talked about you my entire life, Professor Collins. He calls you the teacher who taught me that music could be scholarship. He said you showed him that country music wasn't just entertainment, but a form of historical documentation that deserved academic respect." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly as the full impact of these revelations hit her. The struggling young musician she had encouraged all those years ago had become George Strait, and he had been following her career ever since. Every paper she had published, every course she had developed, every student she had inspired had somehow been connected to that brief encounter in a dive bar decades ago. "There's something else," George said, his expression becoming even more serious. "I've been in contact with Dean Richardson about a proposal. Emma, would you like to explain?" Emma's face lit up with excitement and nervous energy. "Professor Collins, we want to establish the Margaret Collins Center for Music and Historical Studies here at the university. It would be a permanent program that combines traditional historical research with musical cultural analysis, exactly the kind of interdisciplinary approach you've been advocating for years." The document George held turned out to be a detailed proposal outlining the creation of this new academic center, complete with funding provisions, research opportunities, and expanded course offerings. Margaret's name appeared throughout the document, not just as the proposed director, but as the visionary whose work would serve as the foundation for this innovative approach to historical education. The center would offer full scholarships to students from working-class backgrounds who want to study the intersection of music and history, George explained. "Students like you were, like Emma is, like so many young people who believe in the power of education, but struggle with the financial burden of pursuing their dreams." Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted the proposal to read for herself. The scope of what George was suggesting was beyond anything she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about preserving her course or extending her career. This was about creating a lasting institutional legacy that would serve students for generations to come. The center would validate everything she had believed about the academic importance of popular culture and music as historical source material. "But why?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me? For the university? You don't owe me anything." George's expression softened, and for a moment he looked less like the polished superstar and more like the young man she had met 4 decades ago. "Professor Collins, that night at Murphy's Bar, you didn't just serve me coffee and take my order. You listened to my dreams about making music that would mean something to people. You told me that songs could be as important as any historical document because they captured the emotional truth of their times." He paused, looking around the classroom filled with attentive students. "You validated my artistic ambitions when I was just another struggling musician playing for tips and gas money. But more than that, you opened my eyes to the academic legitimacy of what I was trying to do. Every album I've made since then has been informed by your perspective that music serves as cultural documentation." Emma added her voice to the explanation, her words carrying the passion of someone who had grown up understanding the weight of musical legacy. "Grandfather always said that success comes with responsibility. He spent his career trying to honor the traditions of country music while pushing the art form forward. Creating this center is his way of honoring the person who helped him understand that responsibility." The students in the classroom were experiencing their own revelation as they realized they were witnessing not just celebrity generosity, but a profound example of how education creates ripple effects across generations. Many of them had enrolled in Professor Collins' class as an elective, expecting an easy credit toward their graduation requirements. Instead, they found themselves participants in a story about mentorship, gratitude, and the unexpected ways that lives intersect and influence one another. Margaret read through the proposal with growing amazement. The Margaret Collins Center for Music and Historical Studies would offer undergraduate and graduate programs, research opportunities, and public outreach initiatives. It would host visiting scholars, sponsor conferences, and maintain archives of musical recordings alongside traditional historical documents. The funding would come from George Strait's foundation, established specifically to support educational initiatives that aligned with his values. "There's one more thing," George said, reaching for a guitar case that Margaret hadn't noticed him carrying. "I wrote something for you, for this moment, for all the teachers who change lives in ways they never realize." As George opened the case and removed a beautiful acoustic guitar the energy in the room shifted once again. Students who had been whispering fell completely silent, understanding that they were about to witness an exclusive performance by one of music's greatest artists. Margaret found herself a chair and sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the morning. George tuned his guitar with practiced ease, his fingers moving across the strings with the muscle memory of 5 decades of performing. When he was satisfied with the sound, he looked directly at Margaret and began to play a gentle melody that seemed to capture both the melancholy of time's passage and the joy of unexpected reunions. "This song is called The Teacher's Note," he announced to the room. "It's about how small acts of kindness can change the world in ways we never imagine." As the first chords filled the classroom, Margaret realized that her final semester was beginning in a way that would surpass every previous highlight of her teaching career. But she also sensed that George had more surprises planned, more ways to honor not just her personally, but the entire profession of teaching that had shaped both their lives in unexpected ways. George's voice filled the classroom with a warmth and authenticity that only comes from decades of genuine artistry. The song he had written for this moment was unlike anything in his extensive catalogue, intimate and personal in a way that stripped away the production polish of his recorded albums. His guitar work was simple but masterful, each chord chosen to support rather than overshadow the profound message contained in his lyrics. There was a teacher with a dream so bright, working tables in the pale moonlight, books and coffee, hopes held tight, wondering if she'd make it right. Then a stranger with a guitar case saw the wisdom in her face, left some kindness in that place and watched her dreams find their space. Margaret covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely as she heard her own story transformed into melody. The other students sat transfixed, many of them recording but all of them deeply moved by the raw emotion of the performance. Several young women in the front row were crying openly, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing something that transcended celebrity and touched the fundamental human experience of struggling toward dreams despite obstacles. Emma watched her grandfather with pride and her professor with growing admiration, beginning to understand the profound responsibility she would inherit as the next generation of their family's musical legacy. The convergence of these two formative influences in her life felt like destiny revealing itself in real time. George continued singing, his voice growing stronger with each verse. Years went by, and dreams came true. She taught the world what music knew. History lives in every song, teaching right and fighting wrong. Students learned and lives were changed because one teacher rearranged the way they saw their heritage through the power of her knowledge. The melody built to an emotional crescendo as George sang about teachers who work in obscurity, changing lives one student at a time, while society fails to recognize their profound contributions. His lyrics captured the frustration Margaret had felt during budget meetings, the joy she experienced when students connected with historical concepts, and the quiet heroism of educators everywhere who persist despite lack of recognition or adequate compensation. As the final notes faded, the classroom erupted in spontaneous applause that seemed to go on forever. Students were on their feet, some wiping away tears, others cheering with genuine enthusiasm. Margaret remained seated, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she had just experienced, and the realization that this young musician she had briefly encouraged had spent 40 years honoring her influence on his life and career. "Professor Collins," George said, setting his guitar aside, "there's one more thing I need to tell you. When I contacted the university about establishing this center, Dean Richardson mentioned that you were planning to retire at the end of this semester." Margaret nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her decision in light of everything that had just happened. "I felt like I had given all I could give. The budget cuts, the pressure to modify my curriculum, the sense that humanities education was becoming less valued every year. I thought it was time to step aside for younger faculty with fresh ideas. But that's exactly why we need you to stay," Emma interjected, speaking with a maturity beyond her 18 years. "Grandfather taught me that real wisdom comes from experience, from understanding how the past connects to the present. You can't learn that from textbooks or online courses. You can only learn it from someone who has lived it and studied it and taught it for decades." George nodded emphatically. "Emma's right. The Margaret Collins Center isn't just about preserving your work, it's about expanding it. We want you to lead this initiative, to train the next generation of scholars who understand that academic rigor and popular culture can coexist. Your retirement would be a loss not just for this university, but for everyone who could benefit from your unique perspective. The weight of their request settled over Margaret like a warm blanket. After months of feeling invisible and undervalued, she was being asked to lead an initiative that would validate everything she had spent her career advocating. The irony wasn't lost on her that the solution to her professional struggles was walking into her classroom in the form of a former customer from her waitressing days. "I need to think about this," Margaret said slowly. "It's an incredible opportunity, but I'm not sure I have the energy to start something so ambitious at this stage of my life." "You don't have to decide today," George replied gently. "But I want you to know that this offer comes with complete administrative support, adequate funding, and the freedom to develop programs according to your vision. No more fighting for resources or justifying your methods to administrators who don't understand their value." Emma spoke up again, her voice carrying the earnestness of youth combined with the wisdom inherited from her grandfather. "Professor Collins, I chose your class because I want to understand how my family's music fits into the broader American story. But now I realize that you're not just going to teach me about history, you're going to teach me about the responsibility that comes with cultural influence. I need you to guide me through that understanding." The personal appeal from Emma touched Margaret in a way that professional considerations couldn't. Here was a young woman from one of country music's most influential families, choosing to study the academic foundations of her heritage rather than simply coasting on her family's reputation. Emma's commitment to serious scholarship represented everything Margaret believed about education's power to elevate and enrich lives. Dr. Janet Richardson, the college dean, appeared in the doorway of the classroom, slightly out of breath, as if she had hurried across campus. Her presence confirmed that George's visit had been coordinated with university administration and wasn't simply a spontaneous gesture. Margaret realized that significant planning had gone into this moment, making it feel even more momentous. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Dean Richardson said, though her excited expression suggested she had timed her arrival perfectly. "Mr. Strait, I believe you wanted to make an official announcement?" George stood and addressed both Margaret and the assembled students with the same commanding presence he brought to concert stages worldwide. "Professor Collins, on behalf of my family and our foundation, I would like to formally invite you to serve as the founding director of the Margaret Collins Center for Music and Historical Studies. The center will be housed here at the University of Texas, with an initial endowment of $5 million to ensure its permanent operation." The number hit the classroom like lightning. $5 million represented more funding than Margaret's entire department typically received over several years. Students began whispering excitedly, calculating what such an investment could mean for educational opportunities, research projects, and the university's reputation as a leader in interdisciplinary studies. Margaret stood slowly, her legs still unsteady from the emotional impact of the morning's revelations. "Mr. Strait, I'm honored beyond words, but I have to ask why you're doing this. This is an enormous commitment, far beyond repaying a kindness from decades ago." George's expression became deeply serious, revealing the thoughtful artist behind the public persona. "Professor Collins, you taught me that music has the power to preserve and transmit cultural knowledge across generations. My career has been built on that understanding. Every song I've recorded has been an attempt to capture some aspect of American experience and pass it on to future listeners." He gestured toward Emma, then toward the other students in the room. "But music alone isn't enough. These young people need to understand the historical context that gives music its meaning. They need teachers who can help them see the connections between past and present, who can show them that culture is something they participate in creating, not just something they consume." Emma added her own perspective, speaking directly to Margaret with heartfelt sincerity. "Professor Collins, my grandfather could have sent me to any university in the country. He chose this one specifically because you teach here. He said that if I was going to carry on our family's musical legacy, I needed to understand it from an academic perspective first. You're not just my professor, you're my grandfather's choice to help shape the next generation of our family." The personal responsibility, implicit in Emma's words, weighed heavily on Margaret. This wasn't just about accepting a job or leading an academic program. It was about stewarding a musical legacy that had touched millions of lives and ensuring that its cultural significance would be properly understood and preserved. Dean Richardson seized the moment to add institutional support to the personal appeals. Professor Collins, the university is prepared to offer you whatever resources you need to make this center successful. New office space, research assistants, travel funds for conferences, and complete autonomy over curriculum development. This partnership with Mr. Strait represents exactly the kind of innovative collaboration that higher education needs to remain relevant and vital. Margaret looked around the room at faces filled with hope and excitement. Her students, who had enrolled expecting a standard history course, were discovering that education could be transformative in ways they had never imagined. Their enthusiasm reminded her of her own excitement as a young teacher, when every class felt like an opportunity to change the world through the power of knowledge and understanding. The morning sun had shifted position during their extended conversation, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the classroom. Margaret noticed details she had overlooked in her years of routine, the way dust motes danced in the sunbeams, the hopeful expressions of students eager to learn, the potential for magic that existed in every educational moment when approached with passion and creativity. "I need some time to process all of this," Margaret said finally. "This morning I walked in here, planning to teach one last semester and fade quietly into retirement. Now you're offering me the chance to build something permanent, something that could influence how music and history are taught for decades to come." George nodded understandingly. "Of course, but while you're thinking about it, I'd like to share one more thing with you and your students. The song I just performed was actually written by Emma. She's been composing since she was 12 years old, and this particular piece was inspired by the stories I've told her about teachers who change lives." Emma blushed deeply as all eyes turned to her. "I've been writing songs about the people who've influenced our family's music. Professor Collins, you've been part of our story for 40 years, even though we only just met today. That seemed worth celebrating in song." The revelation that the beautiful personal song had been written by an 18-year-old student added another layer of astonishment to an already extraordinary morning. Margaret began to understand that Emma represented not just musical talent inherited from her grandfather, but a new generation of artists who understood the academic and cultural importance of their craft. As the implications of everything she had heard began to settle in Margaret's mind, she realized that this moment would become a turning point, not just in her own career, but in the lives of every student present. They were witnessing history being made, experiencing firsthand how education, music, and human connection could combine to create something larger than any individual contribution. George set his guitar carefully against Margaret's desk and reached into his jacket pocket one final time. What he withdrew wasn't another document or musical instrument, but a small, worn photograph that had clearly been treasured for many years. He handed it to Margaret with trembling fingers, his composure finally showing cracks after maintaining perfect control throughout the morning's emotional revelations. "Professor Collins," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something I've never told anyone, not even Emma until yesterday. That night at Murphy's Bar 40 years ago, after our conversation about music and history, you asked me to sign something. Do you remember what it was?" Margaret studied the photograph and her breath caught in her throat. It showed a much younger version of herself, standing beside an equally young George Strait outside Murphy's Bar. She was holding a notebook, and both of them were smiling broadly. But what made her gasp was the realization of what notebook she had been holding that night. "My thesis proposal," she whispered, the memory flooding back with stunning clarity. "I had been working on my senior thesis about folk music as historical documentation. I was so nervous about presenting it to my advisor, and you were the first person I showed it to. You read the whole thing right there at the bar and told me it was brilliant." Emma stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "Grandfather kept that photograph on his desk in his home studio for my entire childhood. Whenever I asked about it, he would tell me about a brilliant young woman who was going to change how people understood music. He said you taught him that country music wasn't just entertainment, it was American anthropology set to melody." The photograph revealed the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself across 4 decades. Margaret hadn't just been a struggling student who George had helped with tuition money. She had been his first real intellectual influence, the person who gave him academic framework for understanding his artistic calling. Their brief encounter had shaped not just her teaching career, but his entire approach to songwriting and cultural responsibility. Professor Collins, George continued, every time I wrote a song about working people, about small towns, about the struggles and triumphs of ordinary Americans, I thought about your thesis. You argued that folk music preserved stories that formal history often overlooked. You said that musicians had a responsibility to document truth, not just create entertainment. Margaret sank into her chair again, overwhelmed by the realization that her academic work had influenced one of the most successful recording artists in history from its very beginning. The thesis she had written as a 20-year-old student, the paper she had been terrified to present to her professor, had somehow found its way into the creative process of a man who would go on to sell over 100 million records. That's why the center has to bear your name, Emma said, her voice steady despite the emotional intensity of the moment. It's not just about honoring what you've accomplished as a teacher. It's about recognizing that you helped create the philosophical foundation for modern country music's commitment to authentic storytelling. Dean Richardson, who had been listening with growing amazement, stepped forward to address the room. Students, you are witnessing something unprecedented in academic history. The establishment of the Margaret Collins Center represents the largest private donation our university has ever received for humanities education. But more than that, you're seeing proof that ideas have power, that academic research can influence culture in ways we rarely get to witness so directly. The dean's words helped the students understand the magnitude of what they were experiencing. Many of them had chosen college majors based on practical considerations, seeking careers that would provide financial security rather than following their passions. Margaret's story offered a different model, showing how dedication to ideas and knowledge could create influence that extended far beyond traditional academic boundaries. George picked up his guitar again, but this time he handed it to Emma. "Sweetheart, would you play the song you wrote about this moment? The one you finished last night after we talked about everything we were planning to reveal today?" Emma accepted the guitar with reverence, her fingers finding the strings with practiced ease. Unlike her grandfather's seasoned confidence, her playing carried the raw emotion of youth combined with inherited musical talent. When she began to sing, her voice was clear and strong, carrying melodies that echoed her grandfather's style while maintaining her own unique artistic identity. In a classroom where dreams take flight, a teacher's heart burns bright. She never knew the seeds she sowed would grow into this winding road. From coffee cups to concert halls, her wisdom echoes through it all. The girl who worked to pay her way now lights the path for us today. Margaret listened to Emma's song with growing wonder, realizing that she was witnessing the emergence of a new generation of musical storytellers. Emma's lyrics demonstrated not just inherited talent, but a sophisticated understanding of how personal narratives connect to broader cultural themes. The 18-year-old was already displaying the kind of artistic maturity that typically took years to develop. As Emma's song concluded, George made his final announcement. Professor Collins, the Margaret Collins Center, will officially launch with a concert series featuring established artists performing alongside student musicians. The first concert will be held right here on campus in 6 months, featuring performances of songs that were directly influenced by your academic research. I'll be honored to perform, but the real stars will be students like Emma who represent the future of culturally conscious music. The proposal represented everything Margaret had dreamed about during her early career: serious academic study of popular music, opportunities for students to engage with professional artists, and recognition that cultural education deserved the same respect and resources as traditional academic disciplines. The center would validate not just her personal approach to teaching, but an entire philosophy of education that valued creativity alongside scholarship. "There's one condition," George added with a slight smile. "You have to promise to stay for at least 5 more years to get the center established properly. Emma will graduate in 4 years, and she needs you to guide her understanding of how academic research can inform artistic expression. She's planning to major in American history with a focus on cultural studies, specifically to learn from you." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Professor Collins, I want to write songs that matter, songs that help people understand their place in American history, but I can't do that without understanding the history myself. Grandfather says you're the only teacher who can help me develop that understanding properly." Margaret looked around the classroom at faces filled with hope and excitement. Her students were discovering that education could be far more than they had imagined, that learning could connect them to remarkable people and extraordinary opportunities. The weariness that had been crushing her spirit for months was replaced by a familiar surge of purpose and possibility. Standing slowly, Margaret walked to the whiteboard and erased what she had written earlier. In its place, she wrote, "The Margaret Collins Center for Music and Historical Studies," followed by, "Where every song tells a story, and every story teaches us who we are." "Mr. Strait," she said, turning to face George with renewed strength in her voice, "I accept your proposal. Not because of the money or the recognition, but because you've reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Education is about building bridges between past and present, between different kinds of knowledge, between generations of learners." The classroom exploded in applause as students realized they had just witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. George moved forward and embraced Margaret warmly, the kind of hug that conveyed 4 decades of mutual respect and gratitude. Emma joined them, creating a 3-way embrace that symbolized the convergence of past influence, present opportunity, and future potential. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret understood that this moment represented far more than personal vindication or professional success. It demonstrated the mysterious ways that lives intersect and influence one another across time, how small acts of kindness can create ripple effects that span generations, and how education serves as the bridge connecting individual dreams to collective cultural progress. The bell tower chimed 10 o'clock, officially ending the most extraordinary first class in university history. But for Margaret Collins, George Strait, and Emma Strait, it marked the beginning of a collaboration that would transform how future generations understood the relationship between music and American cultural identity. The tired professor, who had walked into that classroom planning her final semester, was walking out as the founder of an academic legacy that would influence scholars and artists for decades to come. Margaret carefully folded the original note from George and placed it back in her briefcase, but now it would be joined by new memories and fresh possibilities. The girl who had once served coffee while dreaming of changing the world through education had discovered that sometimes the universe has its own timeline for making dreams come true, and that the most meaningful successes often arrive disguised as ordinary moments that reveal themselves to be absolutely extraordinary.